Welcome back to the CaMMVets Radio Report on WVOX 1460 or around the world on WVOX.com. We have special guests coming up on the line, but first, here's Ken.
Hey, thanks, Jack. Good afternoon, everyone listening to CaMMVetsMedia here on WVOX.com in our 15th year. And, of course, CaMMVetsMedia stands for Cadets, Midshipmen, the Military, and Veterans. We are very pleased to have with us a Rhodes Scholar, someone who has a PhD from Oxford, someone who's worked in the State Department and worked on the Northern Ireland Accord, and is president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and that is Dr. Richard Haass. Dr. Haass, how are you today?
I'm great, but you left out the most important thing. I also was lucky enough to work at the Pentagon back in the late 70s when Jimmy Carter was president.
Absolutely. So, Key, you've got a new book out. You've written a bunch of books, and the Bill of Obligations, the 10 Habits of Good Citizens, and when Jack and I here have been reading it, so many images of veterans comes to mind, those who have served in the military and gone on to support their communities and be selfless. Tell us a little bit about why you decided to write this book.
Happy to, and again, thanks for having me. Look, it wasn't a book I planned to write years ago. It was more something that increasingly I stumbled onto when I'd be out talking about these issues about China or Russia or climate change or what you name it. And people would say, "Oh, that's interesting. You've talked about a lot of threats, but what keeps you up at night?" And I said, "Well, increasingly, what keeps me up at night is us." And when I listened to my own answer, I said, "Well, I guess the time has come to write a book about us." And this was the result.
Well, it sounds so much. We spent a lot of time reporting on West Point, both athletics and all the events at the academy, and they always talk about building leaders of character. And that's a lot about what you talk about in this book and some of your 10 points about getting involved, being open to compromise, rejecting violence, value the norms, promoting the common good. All about things being part of something bigger than yourself. What were some of the images that you had as you wrote this book?
Well, first of all, you're spot on. It's all about exactly what you described, putting the country first, being part of things larger than yourself. I thought, recently during the elections of the presidential elections just over 2 years ago, the secretaries of state, say, were members of the Republican Party, but wouldn't put that before country when it came to to basically certifying what was a free and fair and legitimate vote count, even though they were under pressure to do so, whether in Pennsylvania or I think it was Arizona. I thought that just showed tremendous courage, as well as, to use the word you just used, character. I thought Liz Cheney showed real character during the January 6th hearings. People in the history, of this country who have stood up in various movements like civil rights. Martin Luther King, who basically said, "Look, our goals are important, but they're not so important that we use violence to promote them. That would be counterproductive." Well, recently, in the Senate, you had some people from across the aisles. First, they came together to pass gun legislation, some limits, and then they came together to fix the Electoral Count Act of 1877. And it turns out that compromising is hard. You get hammered usually from both sides. Some think you did too much, some think you didn't do enough. So it actually, when JFK wrote Profiles in Courage, it's interesting. Several of the senators you profiled were people who actually compromised when it was controversial to do so.
Absolutely. And one of the things that you talk about in the book is teaching civics, and for students, high school, college age, to study the development of the U.S. Constitution and why it works. What are some of the elements of civics that you'd like to see young adults learn about?
Well, a couple of things. One is I'd like them to know the basic documents. So we're about, in 3 years, we're going to mark the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. I hate that the idea that a lot of Americans have never read the Declaration of Independence, or maybe read it once and don't remember it. They should read the Constitution. They should probably read the Articles of Confederation that came before it. At least read parts of the Federalist Papers. I think it would be great if they read a couple of Supreme Court decisions, maybe read a couple of speeches by presidents, either inaugural addresses or farewell addresses, or Lincoln at Gettysburg, maybe read some biographies. I think people need to know the basics of our history. They ought to know the basics of why democracy is worth fighting for, about what it takes, what's expected of citizens in a democracy, which is essentially what I was writing about. I think it's crazy right now that you can graduate from almost any college or university in the country and not be required to take a civics course. So you could spend 4 years on campus and navigate your course requirements and never take civics. Funnily enough, it's really interesting. One of the few places I know you are going to have a civics course in the service academies. And we tend to make sure that the young men and women in uniform understand exactly what it is they're being asked to lay their lives on the line for.
Absolutely. And my colleague Jack McGurk has got a question for you.
Yes, Dr. Haass, I noticed the obligations. The first one you talk about is getting informed. And there was a great quote you mentioned from our former Senator Moynihan saying, "You're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts." What is talk to us about the importance of getting informed, and what can we do to get informed?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a reason I made it the first obligation, because I think it's the most basic, and it's the one that was almost foundational to all else. And it's almost unexpected, but it turns out here we are swimming in information, and we all turn to Google however many times a day, and it turns out it's really hard to be informed because there's so much misinformation out there. So, it means understanding what's a fact and what isn't. I think, it's really useful for people to have more than one source of information, to multi-source it. One really good development in this area is New Jersey, of all places. The governor just signed into law the other week a law, I think it's the first state in the country to do this, where they're going to teach in New Jersey schools what's called information literacy, essentially to make young people critical consumers of information. So if they read something or watch something on TV, they have a pretty good sense of what's a fact and what questions to ask in order to find out whether something is a fact or an opinion, whether there's any backing for it. I'd love to see that done in all 50 states. Indeed, I'd actually like to see that being part of a civics course. That civics both teaches, the basics of government and history, but also teaches you how to be informed or stay informed, because you obviously have to know not just history, but you've got to know about current issues. It's the only way you know how to keep politicians accountable. It's the only way you can figure out what's your own self-interest and how to act on what's good for you and what's good for the country.
And Dr. Haass, you talk about respecting government service, beyond military service, but also the people who work in government agencies, the work that they do for the country. And why did you make that an important part of your book?
Well, two things. We want the best and brightest to go into government. And the all-volunteer force is obviously critical, but there's still more than 20 million other Americans who work in government at the federal, state, and local level. So again, we want good people to go into it, not to be alienated from it or scared off. Government's really important, like it or not. It touches virtually every aspect of our life, from our physical safety to our provides an economic floor to us, may educate us. So I just think government is fundamentally important. So if you don't like it, then improve it. I want Americans to get involved. We ought to borrow from the Army. We ought to have a government that's all it can be. That it really stands for excellent. So tearing it down, it seems to me, we just end up hurting ourselves and each other. And one of the things, by the way, I advocate in the book, and I know you'll like this, is for national service. Not mandatory, almost the equivalent of the AVF, but I want Americans to be incentivized to go work, to do public service, maybe between high school and college. If they do that, they can get trained. It might maybe make it easier for them to get into college or get a job after college. But I'd like to see service become part of what every American does. It's also a good way for people to meet each other. I hate the idea that Americans now are growing up in one part of the country and they may never meet anybody who's different. So I think service is also a great way to bring people together who otherwise wouldn't meet.
I know my father, who grew up in the Bronx, said he met a lot of people through Army service, World War II in Texas, Oklahoma, and all across the country. Now,
There you go.
just a couple of minutes left. Just maybe give us an assessment on the latest on Ukraine. There were some peace plans that were talked about on some of the Sunday news shows, one coming from China. Fareed Zakaria had a plan. Is there any hope on a peace plan emerging soon?
If you use the word soon, the answer is no. I don't think either side is prepared. Ukraine still wants to gain back its territory, wants there to be economic reparations, wants there to be accountability for war crimes. Putin isn't prepared to give up. Putin thinks time is on his side, that if he can just hang in there in a year or two, the West, Ukraine, the United States will get distracted or grow weak. So I don't think either side is prepared to negotiate. The Chinese offer didn't really impress me. Well, I like some things about it. I like that it opposed the use of nuclear weapons. It opposed any attack on a nuclear power plant. But all it called for was a ceasefire. It never said Russian withdrawal from Ukraine. So it was a totally unconditional ceasefire. It's under the Chinese plan. Russians could stay in Ukraine and rearm. And I didn't see how that was a very good idea.
Well, Dr. Richard Haass, thank you so much for joining us. Your new book, The Bill of Obligations, I said it's a great gift for a high school student, maybe a graduation gift. And of course, you're the president for 20 years of the Council on Foreign Relations. I hope you'll call us back on another occasion.
Love to be back with you, and thanks to both of you for what you do here.
Our pleasure. Dr. Richard Haass, thank you for joining us, a Rhodes Scholar and the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, often on the national news shows. Thank you.
You've been listening to the CaMMVets Radio Report on WVOX AM 1460, heard around the world on WVOX.com. We thank today's special guest, Richard Haass, the president of the Council of Foreign Relations. Remember to check out our Facebook pages, CaMMVetsMedia, our Sea Services page, our Iona Basketball Report page, and our West Point Football Report page. And until next week, remember to thank a veteran.
I think it's the first thing you just said.
Economic?
Yeah, that's what I think it was.
Captain, right?
Yeah, oh yeah.